in 2009, 150,000 people came out on the street of London to protest against the Sri Lankan government. You're watching these clips now. They came out to protest against the Sri Lankan government, but also asked the British government and the UN to call a ceasefire and to stop the brutal massacre and the genocide of the Tamil-speaking people. We chanted and chanted for hours, and some of the chants included chants such as Ban Ki-moon, save the Tamils, calling for the UN to break its silence, calling on Gordon Brown and the British government to stop sending arms to Sri Lanka. But the massacre still took place and no one stopped it. Since 2009, the Tamil Diaspora Organization and the TNA have been putting a lot of resources, a lot of Tamil people's resources into the UN. They've been doing countless number of lobbying. They've been traveling to Geneva every year and they've been spending a huge amount of money. But 8 years on and we're still waiting. But the real question that we need to ask ourselves is, can justice and peace be delivered through the UN? Why are all the organizations going after the UN? Why 8 years on we still haven't been given justice? To answer this question, it's important for us to look at the history of the UN, its past and present, its origin, but also look at its structures and objectives. This short documentary is aiming to do this. You should be watching now a short video of the origin of the UN, which will be played now.
On one side were the Allied powers, which included the United Kingdom, France and Russia, and later the United States. Opposing them were the Central Powers,
Intense competition
Germany,
for the world
Austria-Hungary,
resources.
and the Ottoman Empire, while the immediate
Intense competition for the world resources between the world powerful nation states resulted in constant war. Imperialist power wanted to divide up the world for themselves. World War I had left Europe devastated. The countries that fought in it had experienced death and casualties never experienced before. And the total death of all the people who fought in it is thought to be 8.5 million, with almost 21 million people wounded. And because of this horrendous disaster, there has been a mass discontent emerging in all nations, including the so-called world powers. The Russian masses got rid of Tsar, and they wanted to establish a new socialist planned economy. This led to the Russian Revolution in 1917. And this not only impacted Russia, but impacted the whole of the world in all across the countries. In particular, the German workers took to the street to demonstrate their desire, again, for a peaceful and better social order. But on the other hand, the big businesses in these countries wanted to make as much money as they can. And to do this, they also needed relative peace and functioning nations and functioning nation states. But the war cut across their profits. So the big three nations, Britain, France and the US, came together and wanted to punish Germany for the war, and they drew up a peace settlement called the Treaty of Versailles. Now, in this treaty, it outlined that the Germany had to take the full responsibility for starting the war and to pay a huge economic cost. In effect, what the German had to do and the German people had to do was write a blank check to the Allies, and they can cash whenever they wanted. The total sum wasn't decided then, but the total sum came out to be 6,600 million pounds. I mean, that is a huge sum of money, especially in 1919. So German was totally way beyond what German could pay as well. And this had a catastrophic effect on ordinary people in Germany. But as part of this treaty as well, there was also an agreement to draw up a League of Nations, which was set up to keep a world peace. But this League of Nations is the predecessor of the United Nations as we know now. But the League of Nations, although it was called an international body, it selected the countries that had to be in it. For example, Germany was not allowed in, but neither was Russia. Russia wasn't allowed in because they didn't want what happened in Russia to take place in the rest of the world. They feared, as in the establishment feared, that the masses would rise against them to overthrow their governments. And Russia poses a big threat to the establishment. But in World War II, that happened in 1939, there is an evidence that no one would disagree with, that the League of Nations didn't work. But why didn't it work? Because From the beginning, the League of Nations was an alliance of its own interests. It was a mechanism to serve the people that are in it. And in effect, it was really a place that the big nations got together and bullied the small or already wounded nations. That's what it was. So it was never for a peace. And World War II created a huge humanitarian crisis. Fascism, in the end, was defeated, but it had a major involvement of Russia. But the new war started straight away. I mean, the Cold War with Russia. And the West feared that, they feared what happened in Russia could happen to them. So they really feared the word communism. So the Western powers came together to form a defense or military organization to counter this potential threat. And they wanted to establish a new world body to safeguard their own interests. And these nation states, in effect, wanted a safe arena where they could have the battles instead of having an open battles with war. So they wanted war, but in other forms. So the world powers, particularly the US, needed a global organization to maintain its control. The UN was formed in October 1945. Since then, the organization has gradually transformed itself into a global secretariat with a workforce that now has numbers over 44,000 people employed or working for it. And we will shortly see an image of the structures of the UN, and we should also be seeing a video following after that. And we should just watch the videos until we... The United Nations is the main player in the UN. It's also the main funder for the UN. Almost 30% of the UN funding came from the US.
For instance, with matters of economics and social policy, it deals with matters of human rights, it deals with matters of culture. But the most important parts of the UN are the Security Council, which has 5 permanent members who are responsible for controlling its policy. These are France, Britain, the United States, China, and Russia. The other body that is very important is where all the nations meet and come together, and that is the General Assembly. Both the General Assembly and the Security Council pass what are called resolutions to make policy for the world.
The General Assembly in March 2006, through a resolution, created another body called United Nations Human Rights Council. This is a supplementary organization for the UN. It's in effect a subsidiary organs, as they call it. And this particular organ holds regular sessions 3 times a year. It meets in March, June, and September. And the last month, UNHRC was its 34th sessions. And you should see another chart of the UN that explains more of that. But while you're looking at that, let me just explain that the UN has now 193 members, but they are not all equal representation. In the Security Council, there are 5 permanent members: the USA, Russia, Great Britain, China, and France. Now, these all have something called veto, which basically means that they can stop any resolution they want, and the UN can't do anything without their control. So in effect, these nations control the UN, and UN can't do anything without them. But let's just now look at the objectives for the UN. What is there to do? The UN says that it wants to keep international peace and security, that it wants to have equal human rights and self-determination of people, that it wants to develop friendly relations amongst nations, but also justify the use of natural resources. But okay, we will now all agree with these big ideas. We all want them. These are great. But can they? But also, has the UN kept its objective? Well, the reality is that UN cannot deliver on its objectives or keep its promise. UN is a systematic failure. This is not said by us. This is said by the mainstream media that describes the UN overall failure as systematic failure. The UN so-called peacekeeping forces were in countries such as Rwanda and Somalia as the massacre took places, but they did nothing to stop them. The UN Secretary Ban Ki-moon last year, Ban Ki-moon, who was the UN General Secretary, He himself said that Rwanda is considered one of the UN greatest failures. I mean, he said, quote, that the UN is still ashamed over its failure to prevent the 1994 genocide in Rwanda. The UN has completely failed to prevent a genocide. They ditched and waited, and they thought a political process could still be achieved, even though ethnic populations were being slaughtered by thousands. They knew what was happening, but they did nothing. Now let's just watch a video of a woman talking in the protest in 2009. Let's hear what she said.
Now we regret for doing it. This is 15 years past, and we regret for those things to happen. If we don't act now, we will regret for the Sri Lankan Tamils to have had another genocide.
But unfortunately, this is not the only failure for the UN. I mean, I'm just going to give you some examples. There are many more, but just to highlight some of the failures of the UN, is that in Israel and Palestine, the UN passed over 50 resolutions against the Israeli occupation in the Palestine territory. A particular resolution passed in February 2011 stated that, supported by at least 130 countries, even declared the Israeli settlement in Palestine territory were illegal and that the major obstacle to be achieved, and they call for a referendum to take, and they call for and the major obstacle to be achieved of a just and lasting comprehensive peace. But none of these resolutions came to be any effect. The resolution in effect only grew longer, and but in effect nothing took place. And in Kashmir, in 1948, a UN resolution was passed demanding that the Indian government reduces the military presence in Kashmir and held a referendum for independence. 59 years since that resolution, the young people and the people in Kashmir are still waiting to the resolution to be implemented. And Congo, just to give you another example, was that the Major Shaba, who's a Pakistani commander of a peacekeeping base in Shanki, told the Human Rights Watch that the peacekeepers had been alerted of the killing on the eve of it took place, and but the attacks were carried anyway. He said that he called his supervisors and they told him to clarify the situation and to gather more information. At the same time, the people were dying. The members of the UN peacekeeping missions in Congo were literally 9 kilometers away from where the attack took place. But again, they kept their silence and waited for orders from above when killings were taking place. And in Darfur, in 2014, a mass rape of over 200 women and girls by the Sudanese Armed Forces, SAF, in Tabit, which is like 25 miles from the headquarters of the United Nations. But again, they knew, but they failed to once again protect the civilians. And I can go on, but I'm not. But you understand that the failures of the UN are highlighted. And I'm just going to play another video. Just showing the Rwanda video.
Other people to know as well, and other people to listen, and other people to pressure this government and the other governments worldwide
Okay.
to do something.
So
Why do you think that they're turning a blind eye to this?
I don't know. Personally, I don't have a clue. I mean, I don't know. There's probably all these kind of economic and political reasons behind it. I'm pretty
the
sure
video
it
that
has
you
nothing
just
to do-
watched now is by a young girl during the protest in 2009 in the Tamil protest, and she kind of hints what I've been saying all along. I mean, why did they keep silence? Why didn't they do anything about Sri Lanka? They knew, and she kind of said it herself. It had something to do with the money. And just to kind of go into details of what happened in Sri Lanka, Golden Wiss, which is a spokesman for the UN in Sri Lanka during the war, who resigned in December 2009, he also wrote the book, The Cage. In there, he outlined the UN's failure to protect Tamil-speaking people in details, and I advise all of us to, if you can, to read that book. But also, I just want to kind of go into details of what actually has been happening in the UN during since 2009, what kind of resolutions has been passed, what have actually been achieved. And just to give you a brief outline, on the report in May 2011, the UN said that both sides of the Sri Lankan civil war committed atrocity against civilians and called for an international investigation into possible war crimes in 2011. Now, in March 2012, the UN passed another US-backed resolution which didn't really go beyond the LLRC recommendation. In effect, it was pretty much similar to what they said. But at the same time that they passed the resolution, another leaked document, draft, through internal UN draft document, points out to a systematic failure, and it concluded, quote, events in Sri Lanka marked a grave failure in the UN. And that's how the report concluded. In September 2013, there has been no comprehensive effort by the Sri Lankan government to do a properly independent investigation into the war crimes. And the High Commissioner said that she would recommend the Human Rights Council set up its own probe if Sri Lanka does not show a more credible process by March 2014. Later that year, the same year in November, Sri Lanka was allowed to host the Commonwealth Heads of Government meeting, and no one tried to stop it from doing it. In 2014, President Mahinda Rajapaksa said that the UN team the UN team was not allowed to go in the UK, that they were not allowed in. And so the UN just listened to that as well. And just to kind of, a turning point actually in Sri Lanka, which is a massive turning point, was what happened in January 2015, because Maithripala Sirisena became the president. Now that was a whole turning point for them, because the West and the US in particular were happy with this new regime, because the new regime was doing what they wanted them to do. So why would they be angry with them? And so the following year, when Sri Lanka asked for more time, the US agreed with it, and the UN gave them more time. And not only that, but the report that was released in 2015 shows the absolute failure, and we have highlighted, because the report actually diluted the recommendation that they were going to have through the influence of the US. They was actually, in effect, allowing the Sri Lankan government to investigate its own war crimes. That's what the UN did. Now, I just want to show another clip, actually, of what took place in 2016 when the UN General Secretary Ban Ki-moon visited Sri Lanka. UN, when Ban Ki-moon visited Sri Lanka, you should be watching the video now. When Ban Ki-moon visited Sri Lanka, he said, and quote, he said that serious mistakes has been made and that the UN has learned important hard lesson. Okay, so the UN learned lesson in Rwanda, UN learned lesson in Sri Lanka. How many more lessons do they have to learn before they do something about it? We had enough of the apologies. Do something. And when, like the video that you just saw of the protest of the missing people, Ban Ki-moon visited Jaffna, but the protest was taking right outside where he was meant to meet the TNA. But instead of going to those families, he had a private discussion with the TNA behind closed doors. I mean, behind closed door when the protest was taking place. That, for me, highlights an important thing about the UN. Who UN actually is there to represent. They weren't there to talk to the people, but they talked behind closed door to the TNA. And finally, this year, now, last month, on the 34th UNHRC session, the UN has given 2 more extension time to the Sri Lankan government. Now, the UN and the world powers, without a doubt, were aware of the war crimes and the genocide that took place in Sri Lanka. No one has any doubt of that. But they keep in their silence. They keep in their silence then, and they keep in their silence now. 8 years has been, but they have, how much more time does the Sri Lankan government need? how much more evidence do they need? Why is the UN not acting against the Sri Lankan government? The truth is, the UN is very limited how much it can influence a country's decision. I mean, one of its objectives, as I highlighted, is apparently to preserve a country's sovereignty. It therefore wouldn't directly intervene. It can, at most, and these are the words they would use, urge or advise or ask the Sri Lankan government, the very regime that committed the genocide, to take action. That's what the UN can do. Also, because the current Sri Lankan government is friends with the US and Europe, so why would the permanent members of the United Nations want anything wrong? Like, why would they punish the Sri Lankan government? They would do nothing against these government. Now, another example, like we talked about the UN's previous mistakes or what it has done in the past and in relation to Sri Lanka. But let's look at the UN now. I mean, in Syria, the skies in Syria are congested with various armed forces, and like they're being bombed in all sorts of locations and areas. Now, the Syrian government, so they've been bombed by Russia, they've been bombed by US-led coalitions, but also includes members like UK and France. Now, all these so-called all these nations, the Russian, the US, UK, and France, are all members of all four of them are permanent members of the UN Secretary Council, which currently participates. And these councils were set up, let us remember that these councils were set up to keep peace. Are they keeping peace? These councils were set up to make sure that there's self-determination of the people. Are they doing all that? Why are these nations not keeping their own resolution or keeping their own promises? The US government and the West are responsible for millions of deaths in Iraq and Afghanistan. And yesterday, Donald Trump, the president of the US, randomly used a bomb called Mother of All Bombs now in Afghanistan. This bomb is the largest non-nuclear weapon ever been used in the combat by the American military. And Donald Trump, he's proud of it. He is proud of it. Civilian casualties are continuing to be killed and rising. In 2016, they were the highest number of the UN ever recorded, with over 11,500 non-combats killed or wounded, and a third of them being children. So what is the UN doing? Why can't the UN anything against the US? Because the real question is, how can an organization that has warmongers and criminals in it prevent war and secure peace? That's the real question that we have to ask ourselves. The 5-year Syria conflict has left 13.5 million people in humanitarian assistance. 10 million Syrians have been internally displaced by the violence. 4.6 million people have been estimated to flee the country. The situation continued to escalate more and more as the bombs continue. Along with the Syrian civil war, the Iraq war and the war in Afghanistan are amongst the conflict that have resulted in the huge number of refugees and the refugee crisis that we are seeing now. These victims, these innocent people, are paying for a price for a war they never caused. They are paying for a price for a war for resources and conflict by these big nations, but this big capitalist nation. Now, another thing that UN wanted to do was to preserve, to make sure to keep a low poverty level. That is really laughable, because the UN is also, in effect, has a bit of say in organizations such as World Bank and International Monetary Fund. And these organizations are directly responsible for the debts of the world's poorest countries, and they try to make economic policies of mass privatization. They make sure that the country cuts its public spending, and they try and force multinational companies in these poorer countries so they can exploit their labor and exploit their resources. And UN, in paper, apparently stands for human rights, and to be fair, it has helped some countries in some places. But the reality is, it cannot prevent genocide, or it cannot deliver justice, let alone force any government to support the national aspiration of the people or give them the right to self-determination. The UN cannot do that. The UN is very limited in what it can do. And unless the decision is taken by the nations that controls it, in other words, by the US, and if it doesn't conflict with the interests of the other 4 permanent members, UN is helpless. UN cannot do something. UN cannot do anything. But these powerful nations are in conflict. And that's why we say that our rights, Tamil people rights, cannot be won through the UN, because it would open up a massive geopolitical nightmare. Sri Lanka, because of its strategic position, of its geopolitical significance, because of its right in the heart of the Indian Ocean, nations such as China, US, and Russia would have conflict interest in it. And the UN cannot deliver justice for the Tamil people speaking. We need to build our own force, and we need to fight for ourselves, for our rights. Thank you.